Our theme this year is love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Today we're going to talk about love covering a multitude of sins. Love covering a multitude of sins. What does that mean? First of all, what is love? We talked about that in class a little bit this morning. We kind of twist the definition of love, and we tend to associate passion with love, or we substitute love for passion. Love is not about passion, at least described in the Bible. Love is sacrificial. Love, as Charles said, is work. Love is work. How do kids view love? I think it's kind of important to listen to kids since we are supposed to become like children. So what are some things that kids say about love? Well, when asked what love is, this girl, Emily, said, love is when you kiss all the time, then you get tired of kissing, you still want to be together, and you talk more. Mommy and Daddy are like that. They look gross when they kiss. Emily is wise for the age of 8. Elaine, age 5, says, love is when Mommy gives Daddy the best piece of chicken. That's also pretty wise. This girl, Karen, age 7, she said, when you love somebody, your eyelashes go up and down, and then little stars come out of you. Not really sure it works exactly like that, but that's how Karen thinks of love. Noelle, age 7, love is when you tell a guy you like his shirt, and then he wears it every day. See, I try to apply this to my wife, and it doesn't work for her. Because I like to recycle clothing a lot. Right? Because my theory is if you don't sweat in your clothing, then it's clean. Anyone else? No? No? Okay, it's just me. And then Bobby, age 7, love is what's in the room with you at Christmas if you stop opening presents and listen. That's actually pretty profound for a 7-year-old. What does Peter say about love? Love, I think Peter was pretty qualified to talk about love. Peter is one of the 12 apostles. Peter talked to Christ about love. Remember when Jesus said to Peter, Peter, do you love me? Yes, of course I love you. They had that interaction. Christ talked a lot about love to Peter, and Peter not only listened, I think Peter was constantly just wrestling with what it looks like to love, and what does sacrificial love look like. So in Peter's first letter to the churches, he wrote this. Victor read this for us, but we're going to kind of slow it down a little bit and read through it. Peter says, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. I had written a research paper on that passage before because it just was so complex to me. And I was like, what does that mean? Christ suffered in the flesh. Therefore, since he suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. I get that part of the verse. I understand that. Christ suffered. Christ died for us. We're supposed to arm ourselves with that same attitude. We're supposed to be willing to suffer for other people. But then Peter throws this in, and it's almost, for me, it was like this wrench in the spokes. And I was just like, Peter, what are you talking about? For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Has anybody ever suffered in the flesh before? Maybe not to the extent that Peter's talking about here. Certainly we haven't been persecuted. We haven't been tortured. But Peter says, whoever suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. And I was like, but everybody sins. Everybody's sinful. What does that mean? I came to the conclusion, I'm going to spare you all the 25 pages of how I got to this conclusion, but my conclusion is, those who have suffered in the flesh, if you really know what it is to lay your life down for other people, you have no desire for sin anymore. It's not that you won't sin. It's not that you won't mess up. Paul certainly did, right? Paul talks about his wrestling with sin. You know, I do the things that I don't want to do. The things that I ought to do, I don't do. Paul's wrestling with sin. But Paul also talks about crucifying the old self, being raised up a new person, putting away sin, having nothing to do with the flesh. I think what this means is if you really understand what it is to love someone to the point where you will give your life for that person, there's no room for selfishness anymore. There's no room for selfish desires. You're not going to pursue those things. Paul talks elsewhere about the flesh being opposed to the spirit. You can't have one foot in fleshly living and another foot in spiritual living by the Spirit. You can't coexist in those two worlds. Those who have buried themselves with Christ, been raised up a new person, you're done with sin. You want nothing to do with it. So I think that's what Peter's saying here. I think he's saying, if you are willing to die for people, if you're willing to die for your children, right? We're not out hitting the bars and leaving them at home alone, while they're at home and, parentless, raising themselves. You have no desire for that kind of living. If you really understand sacrificial love. So verse 2, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Everything we do is aligned with God's will. You understand that? Everything that we do, love requires us to be aligned with the will of God. Verse 3, for that the time is past, that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. You see, the time's up. You're not going to keep doing what the Gentiles do. They want to live in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. So that time is past, guys. If you understand sacrifice, if you understand what it is to lay your life down for others, you have no desire for those things anymore. See, the Gentiles, people who are not godly, they desire those things. You don't. Verse 4, with respect to this, they're surprised when you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery. And they malign you. Has anybody ever gotten pushback from people? Man, you're just a prude. You're lame. You don't have fun. Yeah, being a Christian sounds awesome. Lock yourself in your house and you don't want to do anything fun. You don't hang out with your friends. You don't drink. You don't, Have you ever heard that? Have you ever been maligned? I have. Verse 5, but they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel is preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the Spirit the way God does. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be self-controlled. Be self-controlled and sober-minded. And I love this part. For the sake of your prayers. Because what happens if we're not self-controlled, if we don't practice self-control, if we don't practice being sober-minded, clear-minded, thinking clearly, what happens to our prayers? If you even pray. Our prayers become about who? Right? Lord, give me this. I've been praying and you've not been answering my prayers and all these other people, they have it better than me. Lord, do this for me. Increase my salary, decrease my debt. Right? Well, if you had some self-control, sometimes that we wouldn't need to be praying that prayer. But when we're not self-controlled and we're not sober-minded, our prayers suffer. We begin praying about us and we stop praying, or we pray less about others. So Peter says, for the sake of your prayers, in light of love, in light of suffering, in light of being done with the flesh, in light of following the Spirit instead of following the flesh, Peter says, you have got to be self-controlled and sober-minded. But he doesn't stop there. He says, above all, above everything else, if Peter's saying, if you don't hear anything else that I'm writing in this letter, you listen to this. You keep loving one another earnestly. I love this word in the original language. We don't pick up the intensity of this word. It means literally, you love each other with tension. This is a term that's used. Now, I presume it was a medical term talking about putting tension on tendons and muscles and things like that. So much so to the point that it's just about to break. Work. You love each other with no slack. You love each other where you're stretched so tight that you're about to break. What does that look like? That looks like work. Let me ask you this, for those of you who are maybe a little more flexible than me, when you stretch yourself to the point where you're just about to break, something's about to tear, does that feel good? No. This is not like this passionate, well, do nice things for each other and, and go out and hold hands and, give the last piece of chicken. That's not what Peter's talking about here. Peter's given this picture. He's painting this picture that looks painful. The readers in the original language would have gotten this painful picture of love. There's no mistaking it. Peter says, you keep above everything else. You keep loving. It's this ongoing love. You keep loving. You don't let up. You keep pulling and stretching and pulling and stretching and pulling and stretching where it hurts and things are just about to tear, and you keep doing that. And just when you're ready to give up, you keep doing it more. And when you think you're going to give up, and when you're crying out in pain and you're crying out in agony and you just don't think you can do it anymore, Peter says, keep doing it. You keep loving each other earnestly with tension, since love covers a multitude of sins. Well, there's another one. I was like, Peter, what are you talking about? What does that mean? And then I became a parent, and we're not even at the teenage years yet, right? There are some times when you see your kids doing some things that makes your eyes start to twitch a little bit, right? Because you see it and you're like, no. But love, when you love with that tension and you love deeply and you love where you're working, you understand a little bit about grace. Have you ever tried to correct your child for everything that they do wrong? How long do you last, right? You give up after a while, right? You can't possibly correct your child for everything they do wrong. And here's the point, we're not supposed to. There are certain things where we need to offer grace, where love requires us, I'm not saying to look the other way, but love requires us to forgive. Love requires us to offer the same amount of grace that God gives us, because we make mistakes often. I don't think there's a day goes by. Let me rephrase that. I know there's not a day goes by where I don't make embarrassing mistakes. I often think, man, if there were a hidden camera right above my head all day long, 24/7, I wouldn't want to replay a single minute. Think about that. If we had a hidden camera that listened in, that watched in on every conversation we had, every word we said about somebody else, every phone call we had, you name it. Would any one of us go back and replay that tape at the end of the day and be like, I did an awesome job today? Right? Love, when we love with that tension, when we love with work, it requires us to be selfless. It requires us to be self-disciplined. It requires us to be sober-minded. It requires us to pray for and pour over other people in prayer. And it requires us to cover these sins. Love covers not some sins, a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another. I wish you would have just put a period there. Without grumbling. As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks as one who speaks oracles of God. Whoever serves as one who serves by the strength that God supplies, in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. To him belong glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. You see, it's not about us. Love is not about us. Suffering is not about us. Nothing that we do should be about us. Do you understand? Do you understand the gravity of what Peter's saying? Love covers a multitude of sins. Love is selfless. Love is disciplined. Love denies yourself, and you give up your life for other people. You're willing to suffer in the flesh and to be done with sin for the sake of others. And by the way, don't complain. Don't grumble in the process. That is a heavy, heavy passage. And Peter doesn't say, this is in addition to some other things, and this is a suggestion. He says, above everything else, love earnestly, love deeply, love till it hurts. I want to encourage you to go out this week and find people. Our passage in the adult class this morning was so powerful. It's about not inviting our friends when we throw a banquet. Jesus says intentionally, don't invite your friends because they could repay you. Instead, you invite the poor. You invite the crippled. You invite those people who are suffering and who can't possibly repay you. Those are the ones that you invite into your banquet, into your feast. Those are the ones that you take care of. Those are the ones that you surround yourself with. My fear is that we've become so selfish and so self-centered that we surround ourselves with only our friends, and we don't have any room at the banquet for anybody other than our own friends. And that runs counter to the gospel. Love your neighbor. Find people to pray for, to pray over, to pray with, and serve them with all of your might. Do it continually. Do it with tension. Don't leave slack when you love others. If there's anybody this morning who has any prayer needs or anybody who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, I encourage you to come forward, or one of our shepherds is here today. The other one's gone today, but you can go to the back or you can come up front as we all stand and sing together.